Most wildlife agencies prioritize game species over the vast majority of life on Earth, which is threatened by the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change.
We need governments that are adapting to the times. We're in a biodiversity crisis, which means an extinction crisis, and we have to do everything we can to fight that. And in part, governments aren't listening to the whole of the US public.
For the most part, wildlife advocates who generally care about wildlife or take part in outdoor activities that don't involve killing wildlife are not represented at all on these commissions. Generally, wildlife commissions in most every state, the states that have them, represent only the consumptive use community.
The key to inclusivity is to recognize all of the beneficiaries of the Wildlife Trust, which is basically that all of nature in the US is held in trust for current and future generations. And that means agencies need to embrace that role as the trustee.
And so what we need to do is bring together a broad coalition of people with a lot of perspectives and a lot of experiences to say, this system is broken and it needs to be changed.
These systems were started in the 1930s with well-intentioned conservationists trying to address a lack of any sort of conservation policy.
You know, until the 1980s, the word conservation was just conserving game animals or animals that we considered to be economic resources at the expense of all other wildlife.
Ecosystems were managed like crops, and wildlife were managed like crops. So we dialed up the species that we were interested in using, and we dialed down the species that we didn't see value.
I really don't think that ecosystem health was ever considered, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It just wasn't in the lexicon. A lot of my career was an uphill battle to have a broader perspective on wildlife management than what most state wildlife agencies do. So that was my motivation.
Wildlife agencies should be the front line of solving the biggest threats we as a society and as a planet are facing, right? The habitat fragmentation, the biodiversity loss, climate change. And yet, because of the way that state wildlife agencies have been historically structured, the way that they've been funded for more than 100 years, those agencies are absent.
In two ways, US wildlife funding is being mischaracterized. For one thing, it's being characterized as coming from hunters and anglers only, whereas they provide a minority of the funding. Pay
to play is what we hear often, but that has to change. Hunting participation is decreasing, and wildlife watchers, those who view and enjoy wildlife without killing them, now outnumber hunters and outspend them by a wide margin across the United States.
The second thing that's missing in the current recipe for funding wildlife conservation across the USA is that a lot of people who have nothing to do with hunting and fishing are contributing, and they're not being recognized for their contributions.
When you are exclusionary, you wall yourself off. That's true regardless of what the issue is. But with wildlife policy, it really is a disservice.
Wildlife belongs to everybody, and that's an interest and a concern and a value that commissions need to be able to address the interests of all these other folks who just want to see wildlife.
The public simply has to become more involved in how wildlife rules and laws are made.
Legal reform should come from a place where all of us are thinking about the ultimate world that we want to live in, and imagining what that would look like is the first step towards then trying to craft policies and craft systems that are going to actually achieve that goal.
So we want to see a world where humans and wildlife live together in a culture of compassionate coexistence, where ecosystems are valued, where biodiversity protection is a fundamental component of decision-making, and where climate change and other threats facing not just wildlife, but having a livable planet for us all are a focus.
Somebody who feels they're impotent or that they're unable to influence things, they're absolutely wrong to start with, because they can have influence.
You are a constituent. You are an important stakeholder in these decisions that affect the wildlife that is held in trust for you.
So I would say to anyone who's listening that you might feel alone, you might feel cynical, you're not alone. There are other people who are doing what they can, and progress is being made.